Hey everyone, we are going to do part two of the civil rights lesson today. The warm up has to do with a YouTube video, which I will play for you. I want you to record two topics that we discussed in the last lesson and two topics that you hope to learn more about today that you hear mentioned in this video.
I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
Human progress is neither automatic nor inevitable. Welcome to WatchMojo.com, and today we'll be learning more about the history of the American Civil Rights Movement. The end of the American Civil War in 1865 effectively meant the end of slavery, but African Americans were in for a long struggle before they were finally awarded equal rights. As of 1870, all eligible male citizens were able to vote. However, blacks were discouraged to by violence and eventually legal stipulations. In 1896, the Supreme Court ruled to maintain racial segregation in private businesses in a case called Plessy versus Ferguson. Soon broadened to include schools, many southern states applied this separate but equal mentality to all aspects of life. However, this led to the application of Jim Crow laws, which resulted in blacks being treated as second-class citizens. Segregated schools, public transit, restrooms, water fountains, and more continued well into the 1900s. In 1909, a group of prominent black and white campaigners created the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP. Their goal was to increase racial equality and challenge issues like the Jim Crow laws. Unfortunately, it was between 1910 and 1930 that white supremacist group the Ku Klux Klan saw its biggest expansion amid increased racial friction. Following the First World War, the NAACP was devoted to ending lynching by white vigilantes. By mid-century, the group became instrumental in the Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka court case. This class action suit, filed in 1951, asked that segregation in schools be struck down. Taken to the Supreme Court, the case resulted in the first integrated school in the United States to open in the fall of 1955. Encouraged by the decision, the civil rights movement began to hold high-profile boycotts, marches, sit-ins, and other peaceful protests. These included 1955's Montgomery bus boycott in support of Rosa Parks. A watershed moment came in 1957 when a high school in Arkansas admitted a group of African American students, nicknamed the Little Rock Nine. Protested by fellow students, the governor, and even the state's National Guard, President Dwight Eisenhower eventually intervened to ensure the students' safe passage. By 1962, universities also began integrating, though black students were still met with protests and violence. The Southern Freedom Movement continued into the 60s with support from newly elected President John F. Kennedy and his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy. The violence of the Birmingham, Alabama campaign influenced the president to fully endorse the movement.
A great change is at hand, and our task, our obligation, is to make that revolution, that change, peaceful and constructive for all.
On June 19, 1963, he proposed a civil rights bill to Congress, which was approved in 1964 after his death with support from President Lyndon Johnson. The bill struck down existing legislation that allowed for discrimination, and its approval was largely influenced by Martin Luther King Jr. and the March on Washington of August 1963. Capturing the attention of the media and the population, this event attracted hundreds of thousands of people in support of civil rights. Following that, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 ended the prejudiced voting system. Instantly effective, blacks began voting and running for public office. However, just days later, on August 11th, a violent six-day riot in the Los Angeles neighborhood of Watts resulted in 34 deaths. This was indicative of a period of racially motivated violence that occurred in the mid to late 1960s. This era also saw the rise of Black Power, led in large part by Stokely Carmichael, in opposition to extremists like the Ku Klux Klan. This ideology was exemplified by the Black Panther Party, which followed the principles set forth by Malcolm X. Rising to prominence in the 1950s, his radical ideas advocated militancy for Blacks.
Black people are dissatisfied. They're dissatisfied not only with these Negroes who have been sitting around here posing as leaders and spokesmen for Black people and actually making the problem worse instead of making the problem better.
He remained an influential and controversial human rights activist until his assassination in 1965. The murders of civil rights leaders continued when Martin Luther King Jr. was killed in April 1968 and Robert Kennedy 2 months later. Despite racial tensions continuing into the 1990s, progress has been measurable. The election of President Barack Obama in 2008 is seen by many to be a culmination of centuries of work in favor of racial equality.
This is the meaning of our liberty and our creed, why men and women and children of every race and every faith can join in celebration across Paul, why a man whose father less than 60 years ago might not have been served at a local restaurant can now stand before you to take a most sacred oath.
Great job listening to that. I hope you captured your items there. I want to leave that open for a conversation in class, so I won't go over any examples right now. Sorry, I have to sneeze. So we're going to start off by talking about sit-ins today. On February 1st, 1960, 4 African-American college students from North Carolina A&T University began protesting racial segregation in restaurants by sitting at white-only lunch counters and waiting to be served. What are possible consequences that they might face for refusing to follow the law of segregation? Well, of course, they can face jail time for breaking the law. They might also be banned from that restaurant in the future and asked not to return, for example. I am actually going to add a quick slide here, kind of just going over what we're doing today, as I usually have today. We have our warm-up, then we're going to have our slides, then we have a poster activity, followed by an exit ticket. With the essential question, what motivated people to participate in the civil rights movement? Which is kind of what we're asking you to analyze here. And they're knowingly participating despite these consequences, these possible consequences. Sit-ins was not a new form of protest, but the response to the sit-ins spread throughout North Carolina, and within weeks, sit-ins were taking place in cities across the South. Many restaurants were desegregated in response to the sit-ins. This form of protest demonstrated clearly to African American and white people alike. The young African American people were determined to reject segregation. In April 1960, the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, was founded in Raleigh, North Carolina, to help organize and direct the student sit-in movement. Would you choose to participate in a sit-in? Why or why not? This is an opinion question, because it takes a lot of bravery to participate in something like this, a lot of risk, similar to previous risky movements throughout history that people have willingly taken on that risk because they think that the payoff will be stronger than the risk. Worth it. We also saw the Freedom Riders during this era. After the sit-in movement, some SNCC members participated in the 1961 Freedom Riders organized by CORE. The Freedom Riders, both African American and white, traveled around the South in buses to test the effectiveness of a 1960 U.S. Supreme Court decision that declared segregation illegal in bus stations open to interstate travel. The Freedom Riders began in Washington, D.C. Except for some violence in Rock Hill, South Carolina, the trip was peaceful until the buses reached Alabama, where violence erupted. In Anniston, Alabama, one bus was burned and some riders were beaten. In Birmingham, a mob attacked the riders while they got off the bus. What might be the punishment for those in Alabama who attacked the Freedom Riders? they would not be very heavily punished because the racism was still thriving, unfortunately. But the violence did bring national attention and fierce condemnation of Alabama officials for allowing that brutality to occur. President John F. Kennedy stepped in to protect the Freedom Riders when it was clear that Alabama officials would not guarantee their safe travel. What else could JFK have done to protect them further? Could have more clearly not only just overstepped those local Alabama officers, but enforced more reprimanding for them, possibly even firing those people who deliberately disobeyed the law that he had put in place, allowing for fair and equitable interstate bus travel. The riders were able to continue on to Jackson, Mississippi, where they were arrested, which ended the protest. The Freedom Rides did result in the desegregation of some bus stations, but more importantly, they caught the attention of the American public. Would you consider the sit-ins and Freedom Riders to be examples of success in obtaining equality for everyone? Why or why not? This is also an opinion question because while you see here it brought attention to the public and did result in desegregation for some stations, the president stepped in to try to protect their rights, but there was still a ton of brutality occurring. So overall, would you say this was a success? Many of the people protesting were violently harmed throughout the process. So it's really an opinion question here. Let's check out this video about the Freedom Riders and their experience. Consider to yourself if you think that you would be brave enough to participate in a Freedom Ride.
Freedom. By the late 19th century, segregation of blacks and whites had become an entrenched way of life in the South. In December 1960, another Supreme Court ruling declared segregated restrooms, restaurants, and waiting rooms for interstate bus, train, and plane passengers unconstitutional. 5 months later, that law would be severely tested by Freedom Riders. The Freedom Rides were organized by James Farmer, director of the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, a civil rights organization rooted in the philosophy of nonviolence. Farmer, who would be arrested with other Freedom Riders, launched the movement to draw attention to the lack of enforcement of recent civil rights court decisions and legislation. As Farmer's volunteers rode into the South, the campaign gained support from civil rights leaders like Ralph Abernathy and Martin Luther King Jr. When the riders arrived in Atlanta, King praised them for their nonviolent, direct action, but he warned of trouble ahead. "You'll never make it through Alabama," he predicted. Activist John Lewis, now a congressman from Georgia, was then a 21-year-old divinity student. He was the first of the Freedom Riders to be attacked when he and a fellow white rider tried to enter a whites-only waiting room at a Greyhound terminal in Rock Hill, South Carolina. Traveling deeper into the South, to Mississippi and Alabama, singing spirituals and freedom songs, the riders were met with hostility, arrest, and more violence. One of the most frightening attacks occurred a few miles outside Anniston, Alabama, on May 14, 1961. A Greyhound bus carrying Freedom Riders was forced off the road by a white mob who stoned and firebombed the bus. The passengers barely escaped the burning vehicle. That same day, several of the Freedom Riders arriving at the Trailways bus depot in Birmingham suffered savage and bloody assaults. Among several beaten by the Ku Klux Klan was 61-year-old Walter Bergman, a college professor from Detroit. Undaunted, he urged others to join the cause and strike while the iron is hot. His fellow rider, Reverend B. Elton Cox, an outspoken minister from North Carolina, also remained defiant, saying he preferred death to segregation. Jim Swerg, a 21-year-old studying to be a congregational minister, was the victim of an ambush attack a week later at the Greyhound bus station in Montgomery, Alabama. Screaming, "Nigger lover," the mob pummeled him, fracturing his teeth and injuring his back. Trained in nonviolence, like his co-riders, he never struck back. As the vicious attacks on the Freedom Riders continued, the National Guard was called out. When hundreds of supporters of the Freedom Rides assembled at Montgomery's First Baptist Church with Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders, an angry mob gathered outside. The National Guard patrolled the besieged church during the long, tense night. At times, however, Lewis recalled, the guards, with their bayoneted rifles, looked like the enemy. With their presence, the violence was quelled, but hostility awaited the riders as they arrived in Jackson. When black riders tried to enter a white waiting room, or white riders tried to use facilities designated for blacks, local police officers ordered them out. If the riders refused to leave, they were immediately arrested and charged with breach of peace. As the Freedom Riders were taken into custody in Jackson, they did not resist. Some bailed out of jail, but many, in a show of commitment to their cause, refused to be bailed out. The jail, no bail tactic, adopted by scores of those arrested, would burden Mississippi's penal system for months. Here's Martin Luther King Jr.
Never in the history of this nation have so many people been arrested for the cause of freedom and human dignity.
While hundreds of freedom riders endured hot, dirty prison cells, civil rights leaders appealed to Washington. Attorney General Robert Kennedy had hoped for a quick end to the protests, and especially the violence. Finally, Kennedy pressured the Interstate Commerce Commission, the agency that regulated interstate travel, to issue a new and stronger ruling banning segregated facilities. The ruling went into effect on November 1st, 1961. It would still be many years before segregation would end completely, but the Freedom Riders had won a major battle in the war against racism.
There's also desegregation occurring at this time in Southern universities. In 1962, James Meredith, an African American person, applied for admission to the University of Mississippi. The university attempted to block Meredith's admission, and he filed suit. After working through the state courts, Meredith was successful when a federal court ordered the university to desegregate and accept Meredith as a student. The governor of Mississippi, Ross Barnett, defied the court order and tried to prevent Meredith from enrolling. In response, President Kennedy intervened to uphold the court order. Kennedy sent federal troops to protect Meredith when he went to enroll. During his first night on campus, a riot broke out when white people began to harass the federal marshals. In the end, 2 people were killed and several hundred were wounded. Some of the arguments for affirmative action go back to this time period. What is affirmative action? That would be taking account the ethnic identity of people applying for a school in order to ensure that that school is admitting a fair amount proportional to the general population of each subgroup of each ethnic group of people. And this was created in an attempt to outweigh or to try to offset the discrimination that African American people faced for so long, where they were not allowed to be admitted to many of the state colleges. In 1963, the governor of Alabama, George C. Wallace, threatened a similar stand, trying to block the desegregation of the University of Alabama. The Kennedy administration responded with the full power of the federal government, including the U.S. Army. The confrontations with Barnett and Wallace pushed President Kennedy into a full commitment to end segregation. In June 1963, Kennedy proposed civil rights legislation. Overall, how important was JFK to the civil rights movement? He was fairly important, although, of course, probably without these, it's an opinion question, but of course, without these protesters, the African American people throughout the United States participating in these protests, he probably would have been less of a prominent figure for civil rights legislation. Much of his legislation was prompted by these protests. I hope that you are all already familiar with the March on Washington, when Martin Luther King Jr. delivered a moving address to an audience of more than 200,000 people. His I Have a Dream speech was delivered in front of the giant statue of Abraham Lincoln and became famous for the way in which it expressed the ideals of the civil rights movement. After President Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963, the new president, Lyndon B. Johnson, strongly urged the passage of the civil rights legislation as a tribute to Kennedy's memory. What is civil rights legislation? Let's break that down. What does that mean? So that would be laws typically on the federal level related to making sure that people are treated equally, regardless of their ethnicity. So it's more than just the 14th Amendment stating that people should be treated equally, but specific legislation stating when and how that comes into effect. If you lived in this time period and got to propose one new law to protect civil rights, what would you propose? This is an opinion question. I hope it will be a fruitful conversation in class. So again, I am going to skip that one for now so that we have more opinions come forth in the classroom. Over fierce opposition from white Southern legislatures, Johnson pushed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 through Congress. It prohibited segregation in public accommodations and discrimination in education and employment. It also gave the executive branch of government the power to enforce the Act's provisions. Do you think this is enough to protect civil rights? What else might be needed? This is an opinion question, but I'd say probably the most common answer here is beyond just passing this law, there has to be a law in place to enforce that law. How are they going to? So it says that they gave the executive branch power to enforce it, but they need to be really specific about what is going to happen, what will be the punishments for people who break this law, and so on. Here's a video about things you might not
On
know
August
about.
28, 1963, 250,000 people gathered in the nation's capital for the historic March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. The march rallied Americans to stand up against the continuing political and social injustices African Americans still faced 100 years after emancipation. The march took place at a critical moment in the civil rights movement. Tension and racial unrest had been building up throughout the year, with anti-segregation demonstrators making headlines in Alabama and President John F. Kennedy announcing his intention to pass civil rights legislation. The timing was right for a massive demonstration. Due to security concerns, internal marshals were trained to ensure order within the crowd. But as it turned out, the marchers chose peace, not violence, that sunny Wednesday. The event featured speeches from prominent leaders and musical performances by Josephine Baker, Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, Mahalia Jackson, and many others. The march is probably best remembered for Martin Luther King Jr.'s acclaimed "I Have a Dream" speech. But we bet you didn't know the real story behind those famous words. King was the last speaker that afternoon, but not because he chose to be. King only spoke last that day because no one else wanted to. When organizers of the march debated who would speak when and for how long, none of the other speakers wanted the last slot because they figured most of the news crews would head out by mid-afternoon. King agreed to go last and to limit his remarks to only 4 minutes. And he didn't have to worry about not making the news. The audience gladly stuck around for his 16-minute speech. And you might be surprised to learn that King hadn't even intended to talk about his now famous dream that day. During a pause in his prepared speech, Mahalia Jackson called out from behind the podium, "Tell him about the dream, Martin." She was referring to a theme King had touched on in a speech 2 months earlier in Detroit. Honoring her request, King departed from his prepared remarks and delivered the legendary speech we all remember today. Historians believe that the marches and King's speech were important catalysts in passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Today, a memorial marks the spot where Martin Luther King described his dream of a better America in one of the most influential and memorable speeches in American history.
We also have a huge movement for voter registration. In June of 1963, Medgar Evers, the NAACP Mississippi field secretary, was shot and killed in front of his own home. In 1964, SNCC workers organized the Mississippi Summer Project to register African American people to vote in the state, wanting to focus national attention on the state's racism. One of the main goals of the KKK had to do with voting. What was it? was to prevent as many African American people as possible from voting. They didn't want they didn't want voting. They didn't want people to have the opportunity to vote. The SNCC recruited Northern college students, teachers, artists, and clergy to work on the project. They believed the participation of these people would make the country concerned about discrimination and violence in Mississippi. Even after they registered to vote, how free do you think people will actually be to vote? It might be possible for people to still be facing discrimination during this time, like intimidation and just comments saying that people of color should not vote, and that might discourage them. The project did receive national attention, especially after 3 participants, 2 of whom were white, disappeared in June and were later found murdered and buried near Philadelphia, Mississippi. Why is voter registration important? Making sure that people are registered to vote and understand how to exercise that right allows them to have more of a voice in government, and if they're voting, therefore, for people who will support people who have been repressed throughout history, such as by creating more civil rights legislation, it can truly go a long way. In early 1965, SCLC members employed a direct action technique in a voting rights protest initiated by SNCC in Selma, Alabama. When protests at the local courthouse were unsuccessful, protesters began to march in Montgomery, state capital. As marchers were leaving Selma, mounted police beat and tear gassed them. Televised scenes of the violence, called Bloody Sunday, shocked many Americans, and the resulting outrage led to a commitment to continue the Selma March. African American people technically already had the right to vote, so why were these protests needed? There was a lot of intimidation happening for people to actually exercise their right to vote, as I talked about on the previous slide. King and SCLC members led hundreds of people on a 5-day, 50-mile march to Montgomery. The Selma March drummed up broad national support for a law to protect Southern African Americans' right to vote. The 24th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution was ratified in 1964. It prohibited both Congress and the states from conditioning the right to vote in federal elections on payment of a poll tax and other types of tax. How would a poll tax be a form of discrimination? Pause to think about it. By taxing people to vote, it's saying that you have to prioritize having this amount of money set aside to vote. So people who were struggling financially would be less likely to prioritize setting aside that amount of money to exercise their right to vote. President Johnson persuaded Congress to pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which suspended the use of literacy and other voter qualification tests in voter registration. Over the next 3 years, almost 1 million more African American people in the South registered to vote. By 1968, African American voters were having a significant impact on Southern politics. During the 1970s, African American people were winning and seeking public offices in majority African American electoral districts. What types of priorities might these politicians be more likely to have? Probably ones supporting civil rights legislation. For many people, the civil rights movement ended with the death of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. Others believe it was over after the Selma March because there have not been any significant changes since then. Still, others argue the movement continues today because the goal of full equality has not yet been achieved. When do you think that the civil rights movement ended? This is, of course, opinion. You'll choose one of these 3 or another time, but I'll wait for a class discussion to talk about that in more depth. What were the major changes for American society during and after the civil rights movement? There are many things you could bring up here, but definitely you would cite the higher voting rates among people of color and higher participation in politics overall, including running for and winning electoral offices, as well as obtaining more equality in education, which therefore led to more socioeconomic equality and equality within the work field. Because of the civil rights movement, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This law ended all legal racial discrimination in public facilities such as restrooms, restaurants, buses, movie theaters, and swimming pools. How might some people still face forms of discrimination even though it would be illegal? There could be person on person racism still occurring, although it would not be illegal to have a sign up that says you cannot swim in this pool. There could be this stigma and just dirty looks people would give other people that would make people hesitant to cross that barrier. It's just one example. Let's talk.
Speaker, Mr. President, members of the Congress. I speak tonight for the dignity of man and the destiny of democracy. I urge every member of both parties, Americans of all religions and of all colors, from every section of this country, to join me in that cause. At times, history and fate meet at a single time, in a single place, to shape a turning point in man's unending search for freedom. So it was at Lexington and Concord. So it was a century ago at Appomattox. So it was last week in Selma, Alabama. There, long-suffering men and women peacefully protested the denial of their rights as Americans. Many were brutally assaulted. One good man, a man of God, was killed. There is no cause for pride in what has happened in Selma. There is no cause for self-satisfaction in the long denial of equal rights of millions of Americans. But there is cause for hope and for faith in our democracy and what is happening here tonight. For the cries of pain and the hymns and protests of oppressed people have summoned into convocation all the majesty of this great government, the government of the greatest nation on earth. Our mission is at once the oldest and the most basic of this country: to right wrong, to do justice, to serve man. In our time, we have come to live with the moments of great crisis. Our lives have been marked with debate about great issues, issues of war and peace, issues of prosperity and depression. But rarely in any time does an issue lay bare the secret heart of America itself. Rarely are we met with a challenge, not to our growth or abundance, or our welfare or our security, but rather to the values and the purposes and the meaning of our beloved nation. The issue of equal rights for American Negroes is such an issue. And should we defeat every enemy, and should we double our wealth and conquer the stars and still be unequal to this issue, then we will have failed as a people and as a nation. For with a country as with a person, what is a man profited if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Speaker, Mr. President.
The Voting Rights Act of 1965 prohibited discrimination at voting polls, established bilingual ballots in areas with large amounts of non-English speaking minorities, and outlawed literacy tests for voters. Remember, what are literacy tests? They were tests that were hypothetically supposed to evaluate whether the voter could read, which arguably is an important skill for voting. But in reality, they were basically complicated civics tests, which were discriminatory because African American people often attended segregated schools where they were not having the opportunity to learn about civics on a high school level, as those tests were asking questions about. This act also gave federal government the power to oversee all elections. Civil Rights Act of 1968 was written as a follow-up to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It was created to enforce equal housing opportunities for all races. Basically said that you cannot refuse to rent or sell a house to anyone, anywhere, based on their race. How is this a problem in the 1950s? What did you learn about when you learned about the suburbs? Many times, African American people were prevented from buying or renting homes in the suburbs and were forced to live in the cities. In what ways can people of color face discrimination today? This is an opinion question, although I hope that everyone will recognize that there are still at least minimum subtle racism that still occurs in the country today. For the activity today, I'd like you to imagine that you are organizing a sit-in and create a flyer to encourage others to attend your sit-in. Include where, when, why, what you hope to achieve, and be persuasive to help others understand why it is important. The intention is for you to convince others to attend your sit-in with you because there is power in numbers. For the exit ticket, I'm going to play a final video, and these are the questions you'll think about. Before the sit-in protests, who was allowed to sit at the Woolworth lunch counter and who wasn't allowed to sit at the Woolworth lunch counter? So this video is specifically about the Greensboro sit-ins. Why did the students choose to stage their protest at the Woolworth lunch counter specifically? On what date did the protest start? What hypocrisy did the students hope to highlight by staging the protest? And did the media cover the protest? Do you think that helped spread it to the other 54 cities in the South? Why or why not? Oh, of course. Fun times. All right, let's try this one. See how good it is.
The food was bland, the coffee weak, the atmosphere sterile. But the stools in this lunch counter are more treasured and more symbolic than any seat in a five-star restaurant. What was served up at this very counter was the sweet and satisfying taste of freedom. This was the main stage of one of the greatest dramas of the 1960s, the so-called sit-in civil rights protest. It was about 80 feet long. The stools were classic diner pieces, covered with vinyl, backed with chrome. One other feature of these stools made a lot of people uncomfortable. You could only sit on them if you were white. It wasn't an official company-wide Woolworth policy, but each store manager was allowed to segregate the counter if he chose to, and the department store giant was a landmark of Main Street America. So when four young Greensboro men wanted to challenge the invisible color line, the date was February 1st, 1960. The four teenagers, freshmen at a local university, entered Woolworth's and began shopping for school supplies. It was a calculated move, meant to point out the hypocrisy of a store which would accept their money at the checkout, but not at the lunch counter. Receipts in hand, 2 by 2, they approached the woman expected to be cracked over the head, hauled off to jail, or both. And sure enough, a police officer soon appeared.
And he started to pace the counter back and forth. And as he walked back and forth, he started to pound his nightstick in his hand. But after he paced 3 times with his nightstick, I said to myself, we got him. He really doesn't know what to do.
Greensboro Four, they would soon be called. David Richmond, Franklin McCain, Ezell Blair, and Joseph McNeil. The defiance and pride visible on their faces would be severely tested in the months ahead. Every day, the Greensboro Four and a growing number of black and white supporters returned to the lunch counter. Taking shifts, they occupied the counter stools all day, enduring insults and threats from hostile bystanders. With newspapers, television, and radio closely following the protest, sit-ins spread throughout the South. Segregated lunch counters in 54 cities were taken over by the protesters. Still, the management of the Greensboro Woolworths stuck by its guns, and the corporate bosses for 6 months, protesters and waitresses glared at each other across this counter. Finally, on July 25th, 1960, the F.W. Woolworth Company ordered the Greensboro store to give in. Throughout the department store chain, the lunch counters were officially desegregated.
As time went on, it ceased to matter because you could come in around lunchtime and you could see alternating almost black, white, patrons, and nobody paid much attention to it. And you ask yourself, I did quite often, what was all the fuss about? What was all the mistreatment about? I mean, what was this thing that people were so afraid of?
The old lunch counter Greensboro Woolworths closed for good in 1993. But before the store was shut down, 2 8-foot sections of the surviving original lunch counter were removed. One was sent to the Smithsonian Institution, and the other to the Greensboro Historical Museum. The remaining 30 feet of the original countertop remains in place in the cavernous old building. The old Woolworths is being converted into a civil rights museum, and even though it is not yet officially open, visitors can drop by and actually sit on one of the famous stools. And thanks to what happened here in 1960, everybody is welcome to take a seat.
All right, I feel like that had most of the answers. We'll use this one. It was a good alternative from the History Channel. Of course, it was reposted by Not the History Channel, per usual, for these kinds of videos. But thank you all so much for listening. I hope you had a good time.